Let me start the recording. It's my great pleasure to introduce my friend, whom I have a distinct privilege to call a friend, Father Andrey Kordochkin, whom I know for a number of years now, and who is a priest, a researcher, a historian. He is the rector of the Russian Orthodox Cathedral in Madrid, which was, parish itself existed before Father Andrey came to Madrid, but he certainly rejuvenated it and built magnificent cathedral there. So hopefully one of these years we'll manage to go on a pilgrimage to Spain as well, and would have a pleasure to co-celebrate with Father Andrey in his newly built church. But today I invited Father Andrey to give a presentation on the Orthodox sites, saints, and wouldn't say Orthodox, but early Christian sites and saints of Spain. We as Orthodox inclined to acknowledge more our historical past that comes from the East. However, the West is certainly a treasure trove of things that are of great interest and inspiration to us as Christians. So I, for years now, see it as my mission to bring those long forgotten, but nevertheless awesome and wonderful sites to people's attention. And certainly Father Andrey is an expert in early Christianity in Spain, is a great asset in discovering this long lost, but nevertheless marvelous past. So instead of talking for a long time, I'm passing microphone and camera to Father Andrey. Welcome, thank you for sharing your time. It's already past 10 o'clock, so thank you for being with us. And thank you for all our guests for your presence. As I know that usually not everyone stays till the very end of the presentation, I just make a small announcement that on Mondays and Thursdays at 8 o'clock Moscow time, we're having presentations in Russian from all the Christian spectrum, history, archaeology, patristics, biblical studies, pilgrimage and such. Some of the lectures are presented by me, others are by guest speakers. This coming Monday, we're going to have Dr. Armin Kazaryan talking about the sacred legacy in Karabakh. And then on Thursday, we'll have Manana Harugashvili, who is a historian, talking about coming of Christianity to Georgia. So those two presentations will be in Russian. So those of you who are able to participate, you are most welcome to join. Lectures in English would continue on Sundays. Announcement about the upcoming lectures are posted on my Facebook page under my name, Ilya Gatlinsky. All of the lectures are recorded and posted on YouTube again on the page with the same name. So thank you, and Father Andrey.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I'm not a historian, so what I'm going to talk about may be somewhat amateurish. So maybe if someone of you is a professional historian and will have some insight and contribution, he or she would be more than welcome to contribute. Well, Father Ilya said that there has been little interest in the Orthodox milieu in the tradition of Christianity in the Western Europe. But I think that in the last few decades, there has been a considerable revival of this interest, especially regarding Christianity on the British Isles, in Britain, in Ireland. Also, I think that most people who would come to France for a long time would have known, for example, who is Saint Genevieve of Paris. But Spain, in this respect, I think has been a black hole in a sense. So, for example, in the Russian historical theological tradition, I don't think that any single primary source on Christianity in the First Millennium has been translated into Russian until very recently. So if you'd ask someone in Russia, what do you know about Christianity in Spain? They would say, well, we have heard about Reconquista, or we have heard about the Inquisition, but what was happening here in the First Millennium is quite unknown. And of course, this period for us is important because if we trust the date of 1054 as a date of division between Rome and Constantinople, well, of course, this date is quite a relative one. and there has been schisms before, and we know that the separation between the churches has been a long process rather than an event which took place at a particular time. But when we're speaking about Christianity in Europe in the first millennium, we're speaking about the undivided church. So we speak about the history of the Orthodox Church in Spain. Well, what do we know about it? If we begin from the start, we begin with the names of the two apostles, Apostle Paul and Apostle Jacob. Now, Apostle Paul, in his epistle to the Romans, 15:24, he only expresses his intention to come to Spain. So there is no testimony that he ever did. Although one of the Spanish historians said that, sort of giving a proof that Paul came to Spain, he said that it was not really in the character of this man to have an intention to do something and not to do it. But there is no, of course, there is no proof of his coming to Spain, although Clement of Rome in the first century, he says that Paul brought Spain to the end of the earth. Now, end of the earth is something more than an image. Most of the Greek-Roman writers on geography, they would see the end of the earth somewhere on the Iberian Peninsula. And there is still a place, there is a small peninsula in the northwest of Spain, which is called Finisterra, which of course corresponds to the ends of the earth in Latin. Well, with Apostle Jacob, it's more complicated because there are what people suppose to be his relics in the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela, and he is considered to be a patron of Spain, at least for the last 1,400 years. Now, regarding Apostle Jacob, who was, of course, the brother of Apostle John, the sons of Zebedee, those who take a more critical point on his possibility of preaching in Spain, they ask three questions. Well, the first one is, if Apostle Jacob is the only apostle about whom we know from the scriptures that he suffered his death as a martyr in Jerusalem, according to the book of the Acts, chapter 12, verse 2. Now, how could he have traveled to Spain in the meantime? Because it was a long journey. The second question which they would ask is this: they would say, if he really died as a martyr in Jerusalem, how come that his relics have been discovered in the northwest of Spain? And the third question which they ask is, if this was really the case, now why is it that the whole Christian tradition in Spain is silent until about his preaching and his coming to Spain until the year 600, which is probably when his coming to Spain is mentioned for the first time in the written source. So, for example, St. Isidore of Sevilla, who we'll remember later on, when he's writing the history of Goths and trying to trace the history of the Christian tradition in Spain, he has no mention of Apostle Santiago, and it's obviously that he didn't know about it. Well, what can we reply? Nothing. There is no historical testimony pointing to which could confirm the arrival of Apostle Jacob to Spain, but what we can say for sure is that the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela is a holy place, and that through the prayers of thousands and thousands of people to Apostle Santiago, he really became a patron of Spain. Now, what do we actually know from historical sources for sure about the Christianity in Spain? Well, as I said, that there is a testimony of St. Clement of Rome, although he doesn't actually speak about Spain, but Irenaeus of Lyon does, and he speaks about Christian communities in Spain. Now, if he's writing in the middle of the 2nd century, we may well suggest that these communities have already existed before that. And a more detailed testimony is not already middle of the 3rd century. It's a letter of Cyprian of Carthage, which he writes to the Christians of the cities which we would now call Astorga and Leon. And this letter is also the first testimony on the persecutions of Christians in Spain. Another interesting testimony are the Acts of the Council, which we call the Council of Elvira. Elvira corresponding to the city of Iliberi, which what we would think it is Granada in the present geography of Spain. And these acts of this council, they correspond to the pretty much first decade of the 4th century. And they're interesting because they're actually the first and the earliest acts of a church council which have been preserved. Although the historians think that out of the 81 acts of the council, only 21 is authentic. And a couple of them are interesting. One of them, for example, forbids to represent images on the walls of the churches and to venerate them. So the Catholic Church would say that this was an attempt to protect them from profanation. And the Protestant tradition would, of course, say that this is one of the testimonies which would show that the church tradition before the Emperor Constantine is largely iconoclast. But what we gather from the Acts of the Council and from the signatures of the bishops who came is that, well, first of all, the Christian communities were concentrated mainly in the south of Spain, in what we would now call Andalusia. And this would lead many scholars to think that there was especially a strong connection between the Christianity in Spain and in Africa. Of course, there's this letter of St. Cyprian of Carthage, which he's writing from the north of Africa to his Spanish readers. And also the geography of the communities also corresponds to the geography of Jewish communities of the time. So many people would be inclined to think that the first communities would have this sort of Judeo-Christian character. And one of the bishops who signed the acts of this Council of Elvira was a very famous person, St. Osius of Cordoba. Now, St. Osius is important because he is one of the key figures of the Nicene Council, and he had special authority and special he was very respected. His signature comes first, and if the Orthodox Church remembers Osius for and commemorates him as a saint for opposing the Arian heresy, it's interesting that the Catholic Church never accepted him as a saint. And precisely because what we know from the writings of St. Athanasius the Great, that towards the end of his life, he accepted into communion two people who were half Arians, and he also signed a kind of a doubtful creed. So if for the Orthodox, Osius was sort of a key figure in the fight of the church against Arianism, in the Catholic Church, he would always remain under certain suspicion for being semi-Arian himself. So it's interesting that he never received any liturgical veneration in the West, although people in Spain and especially in Cordoba, they find it difficult to accept that the bishop of their city is venerated by the Russians and by the Greeks, but receives no reception as a saint in the Catholic Church. So if we speak about this first period of in the chronology of Christianity in Spain, which we can roughly divide into the Roman period, the Visigothic period, and the period of the Arab conquest. Well, most of the saints that would relate to this period, of course, are martyrs. And most of them that we know from the literary sources and archaeological sources would have suffered in the beginning of the 4th century, some of them earlier. And Osius is probably the only exception of an early church saint from Spain who actually was not a martyr. Well, the second period, in the beginning of the 5th century, the Iberian Peninsula is invaded by various tribes, and among them, the tribe of the Visigoths is the most powerful, the most important, and in the course of the history, it gains control over the whole of the Iberian Peninsula, and you have this sort of proto-Spanish state on the territory of what would now be Spain and Portugal, and also a part of France. Well, the Visigoths who come to Spain in the first place, they're Arians, and this would be apart from their dogmatic identity, but it would also form a part of their political identity by opposing themselves to the Franks. And in the end of the 6th century, something important happens. A son of a Visigothic king, whose name, in English would be, I guess, Ermenegeld, probably, son of Leovigild. He is married to a princess of France, whose name was Ingunda, and she was, of course, Orthodox, as all Franks, or, well, if you're Catholic, you may want to say that she was Catholic. And under her influence, and under the influence of the Bishop of Sevilla, Saint Leander, which Sevilla, of course, was not Sevilla at the time, was called Hispalis, he is converted into Orthodoxy, and he begins a war against his father, and he loses it, and he finds himself imprisoned, and he dies as a martyr in 584 because he refuses to accept communion from the hands of the Arian bishop. But when his brother Recared gains the throne in the year 589, there is a council gathered in Toledo, in the middle of Spain, which was then at that moment the capital of the Visigothic Spain, very close to Madrid. And at the council, the Orthodox Catholic, whatever you call it, faith is pronounced as a state religion. And what actually happened is that the fathers of the council were so keen to defend the divinity of Jesus Christ that the text of the creed seems to be for the first time modified, and it was pronounced that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and from the Son. And all of us know pretty well what happened after that. But of course, the fathers of the council had no idea to make an opposition to the main body of the church by changing the creed. The other way around, they made an effort to convert the Visigothic people to what they believed to be the universal truth of the universal church. So from the year 589, for some 130 years, there was this short period which we can well describe as a golden age of Christianity in Spain. First of all, remember this figure of Saint Leander, who was for some time, he spent some time in Constantinople, where he knew the future Pope Gregory the Great. So he was one of these figures who were kind of uniting the East and the West in the history of the church in Spain. And then when he died, the bishop in Sevilla was his brother, St. Isidore, who is quite a famous figure in the West. He was really the first medieval sort of encyclopedian, and he was very important, not just as a theologian or as a historian, but he also made a theological construction of which you may want to describe as a symphony between the church and the state in the Visigothic Spain. And because he was really sort of a very highly intellectual figure and writing the first European encyclopedia, his fruits of his labor, the Catholic Church basically proclaimed him as a patron of internet. Well, in the Visigothic kingdom, it was a special time of flourishing of theology, of science, and of course of the monastic tradition. And the monasteries at the time we find in the cities, we find in the desert, and later on we're going to speak about some especially important figures in the history of monasticism. And it's important then in the Visigothic kingdom, the way that it sees itself, it doesn't really see itself as a wild tribe that conquers Spain. St. Isidore sees himself and the culture of his country as an heir to the Roman culture. So basically how they see themselves is that the Rome has fallen, and they are the people who preserve the Roman culture and the Roman identity, and in a way they did, until the Arab conquest, which began in the year 711. And we see that in 10 years, more or less until 721, almost all the Iberian Peninsula from the south to the north has been conquered by the Arabs. And in 1721, approximately, there is a very important event, which is a battle in Covadonga. We're speaking about the north of Spain, in what is now called Asturias, where a very small group of Christian warriors managed to win a battle over the Arab troops. And this is for the Spanish history and identity is very important. This is when the Reconquista began, when the Christians began to gain control over the land which they lost. And if you look at the map of Spain, or if you imagine it, what took for Arabs 10 years for the conquest, it took for the Christians some 7 centuries to gain control over it, until the end of the 15th century, when Granada was finally conquered by the troops of the Catholic kings. Now, what do we know about the existence of Christians in this period? Well, there are 2 modes. On the one hand, there is a small part of Spain in the north which is free, and where there is a small reign, where the Christian culture and the Christian identity and monastic tradition is being preserved. But of course, there is also an important Christian community which lives within the Muslim framework. And although it is somewhat fashionable to represent the history of the medieval Spain as a kind of a paradise of coexistence between the Jews and the Christians and the Muslims, but this is very far from truth. And one of the very interesting testimonies in this respect are the writings of a priest who lived in the 9th century in Cordoba, which is then the capital, whose name is Eulogius. And he's describing the suffering of what we now call in the historical science, the voluntary martyrs. Now, the voluntary martyrs were Christians who would come by their own initiative. They would present themselves to the Muslim authorities. They would confess themselves as Christians, and they would, of course, denounce Islam, and they would suffer death as martyrs. Now, the interesting thing here is that this was not really the conflict. This was not a conflict between the Muslims and the Christians. It was hugely a conflict within the Christian community, because some of the Christians thought that these people are saints, but most people, including the bishop at that time, they would not see them as martyrs, and they would not recognize them as saints, but they would just think that these are the people who are trying to provoke the government and who are trying to destabilize a situation which is already too delicate. And these people would bring in 3 arguments. They would say that in the first place, these people are not martyrs because Islam is not a pagan religion, like the religion of the Roman Empire. Now, the second would be that in no case the Christian would be forced to participate in idolatry, because to some extent they did have some liberty of liturgical celebration. And the third argument was quite interesting, because they would say that, well, at that time there was already a certain literary tradition of describing the suffering of the martyrs in the Roman Empire. And of course, this association, their martyrdom would be associated with many miracles, which would happen at the time of their death or shortly afterwards. So at that time, many Christians would say that if someone dies without any special sign and his body is cut into pieces and is given to the dogs, and there is nothing special happening, now these people, how can we consider them to be saints and to give them veneration? Now, Eulogius is defending them. He's not only describing their martyrdom, but he's also defending their case until he himself dies as a martyr, because he being a priest, he hides a girl in his house Lucretia, who converted from Islam to Christianity, and this was already a crime. And he and she died as martyrs. And I think that the writings of St. Eulogius are actually translated into English. Now, half an hour. The half an hour which is left, I want to show you some photos and some pictures, because you can study the history of Christianity in Spain in the first millennium, not just through the books, not just by reading, but also by watching and by traveling. And there are some important testimonies of what we can identify as the Christian artistic heritage in Spain in the first millennium. So now I'll try to open these photos and see if this works. Just 1 second. Sometimes it takes time. Just 1 second. Yep. Almost there. Now, can you see it? Hopefully, yes.
Yes, yes.
Very good. Now, here we are in Santiago de Compostela, in the cathedral where the relics of Apostle Jacob are being preserved. The original church, which was built upon finding his relics in 1812, was destroyed by the Muslims around the year 1000. So what you see here, it's hard to say when the cathedral was built, because they began building it in the 11th century, and much of the decoration that you see is obviously later, almost, well, up to 18th century. And here is the ark which the faithful venerate when they come to the crypt of the cathedral. Now, in the last few decades, there has been an important revival of the pilgrimage by foot, which people are doing to reach the tomb of the apostle. And here you can see a map of Spain with the routes that lead to the tomb from various parts. And the most important route is the green line that you see. It's the so-called French route, which I think, if I'm not mistaken, takes about 900 kilometers, which should be some 600 miles. But if you want to walk following any route, basically you're obliged to walk at least 100 kilometers, which should be some 65 miles, in order to get a diploma of the pilgrim. Now, when you need to have a special kind of passport, which looks like this, and if you make 2 stamps daily when you travel, then when you come to Santiago, it's a kind of a proof that you didn't drive to Santiago. So you have to walk for 100 kilometers, or you have to travel 200 kilometers by horse or by bicycle. And when you finally come to Santiago, this is the kind of diploma that you get with your name written in Latin. These are just a few pictures from the pilgrimage that we did during the last sort of 5, 6, 7, 9, 10 years. So sometimes the path takes you through the forest, sometimes through the fields, through villages, but on the whole it's quite picturesque. Now, the end of the earth. We mentioned that Clement of Rome was saying that Apostle Paul brought Christianity to the end of the earth. So with this photo, we're in a peninsula in the northwest Spain called Finisterre. And this is when, according to one of the Roman chronicles, when the Roman troops came and they saw the sun going down to the sea, they realized that the world ends here. And on this peninsula, there is a nice, what's the English word?
Lighthouse? Lighthouse?
Lighthouse, yeah, that's correct. So the lighthouse on Finisterre is the second most visited place in Galicia after the cathedral in Santiago. So, of course, Santiago is not on the sea, it's not on the ocean, but many people, because they travel from 100 up to 900 kilometers to reach Santiago, some of them go further 80 or 90 kilometers, and they go to the sea. They go to this place called Finisterre, where there's also a special kind of diploma which they may get. And there's a tradition of burning one's clothing or footwear in which they did their way of Santiago, which is in theory is forbidden due to the fire hazard. But here you can see a couple who are observing some of their objects disappearing in the fire. So a couple of pictures taken there, and people leaving their shoes and things. Now here you're in the, you see the map of the Roman provinces around the year 300. So there are 5 of them, and as I said, the vast majority of the communities were concentrated in the south part called Baetica, which approximately corresponds to what we now call Andalusia. One of the most important martyrs, Saint Eulalia, who suffered when she was around 13 in a city called Merida, which is Extremadura, sort of between Madrid, halfway between Madrid and Portugal. And she's important because maybe she, as well as Saint Vincent, were the 2 Spanish martyrs who just did not receive the local veneration on the Iberian Peninsula, but they were known all across Christian Europe. So what you see here is an icon painted in Russia, quite sort of along the line of the Fayum portrait. And we have given this icon as a present to the cathedral in Oviedo in the north of Spain, where her relics are kept. And the cathedral then gave us a part of her relics as a gift, which some of it is venerated in an icon in the church, and another part we put into the altar of the cathedral when we were dedicating the church. Well, this is the cathedral of Oviedo, and you can see that in the center, where there is an ark with her relics, there is this image which we gave to the cathedral as a gift. Now, here we're in Merida, and we're in a medieval church which is built upon early Christian cemetery. And when you're there, you can actually see quite well that the whole Christian necropolis was built around one grave in the center, which was the grave of Saint Eulalia. But what happened to her relics, as well as to many others, is that with the Arab conquest, they were taken to the north of Spain, to the city of Oviedo, which we now call Oviedo, to preserve them and to save them from the conquest. So there is an important number of early Christian relics in this place. And on the whole, if you're after the Spanish art of the first millennium, you're much more likely to find things in the north rather than in the south, because it was where some of it, at least some of it, has been preserved. Now, another martyr, Saint Leocadia, who suffered in the city of Toledo, not far from Madrid. And also it is an icon which we donated to the cathedral, and also receiving a part of her relics as a gift. And because what we received as a gift was a part of her skull, we did this reliquary sort of in the medieval tradition with in the form of the head of the martyr. Now, middle of the 6th century, you can see the Visigothic kingdom, which at this stage occupies most of the peninsula. At this time, south of Spain belongs to the Byzantine Empire, as well as all the 3 Balearic Islands. You can also see that the part which is less accessible because of the mountains in the north of Spain is still populated by various tribes who also are quite hesitant to convert to Christianity. And in the northwest, you find this kingdom of the Sueves, I guess, in English. So, which they also were Arian for a long time, but then they were swallowed up by the Visigoths. One of the very interesting examples of the Visigothic architecture is this church, San Pedro de la Nave. Well, most people would date it 7th century, which I think is correct, although some people would date it with, they would give a later chronology. And it is interesting because if you enter inside, it has a lot of figurative carving, which is very peculiar. This is what the church looks like. Now, if you look at the arch in the altar, I think many people would say, aha, we know this is Muslim. But if you accept the date of these Visigothic churches being 7th century, you realize that when the Muslims came to Spain in the 8th century, they still have no architectural artistic tradition proper to them. You know, Islam is very young. So many people would suggest, and this is what I also believe, is that this form, kind of as a keyhole, which we would associate with the Muslim art, it really has Spanish, Christian, and Visigothic origins. And then the Arabs would take it on. And of course, this is something that you often see in the Muslim architecture, especially in the famous mosque of Cordoba, which was then converted into to be a Christian cathedral. Well, we did our liturgy there once with a group of pilgrims. And this is a brilliant view from the window, which is a perfect icon for me, although I'm not an iconoclast. And these are some examples of carving, 7th century. So what you can see here is it's a capital of a column, and of course the sacrifice of Abraham, an apostle whose name we do not know, Daniel in the lion's den. It's not, well, it's a bit sort of dizzy, but I think it was a bit dark in the church when I took the photo. Now, this is an important 7th century church, and we know that quite well. It was dedicated in the year 661 by a king called Resuswinth, because there is a stream of water, and this is where he, according to the tradition, got a healing from a problem which he had with his kidneys. So it doesn't have any figurative carving, but it still has a very interesting interior, which is, well, as authentic as it can be. So 7th century. And this is the font where we're doing the blessing of the water with our pilgrims from Madrid. Also another interesting example of the 7th century architecture. This is a crypt of the cathedral in the city of Palencia, not to be confused with Valencia. Palencia is, well, let's say north of Spain, the part which we call Castilla Leon. Now, Saint Emilian is a Spanish monk. He died in 573, and he is important. Why is he important? Well, of course, there are many monks who belong to this period, but he was lucky enough to have his life written by a bishop of Saragossa some 60 years after his death. And his life is really something for Spanish hagiographic literature, something that you can compare to the life of St. Sergius of Radonezh in the Russian tradition. So this is really a foundation of the Spanish hagiography. And to put his story short, well, he was looking after sheep in the mountains, and then he became living as a monk, as a hermit. And according to his life, after some 40 years which he lived in a cave, after suffering all the possible temptations which a monk can suffer, the ultimate temptation came into place. And what happened? Well, he was ordained a priest and sent to a parish. Why did that happen? Well, we doesn't really know that from his life, but we know the context. And the context is that we know also from the Visigothic legislation that there was a certain strain between what we may call an institutional church and the bishops and the monks who lived, well, as they could. And the bishops basically tried to find a way of controlling them. And at this stage, according to this Visigothic legislation, these free monks would be treated equal as vagabonds. So it seems like when he was ordained a priest, it was really a form to gain control over him rather than recognize his merits. But it didn't last for very long because there came all kinds of accusations. So he had to withdraw from his priestly office, and he died in a small community which he founded. And this is an icon which we have in our cathedral, where we try to reconcile the Byzantine iconography with the tradition of his representation in the Catholic art. Now, this is a small chapel in the cave where he lived. We're here in the part of Spain which is called Rioja, which is more famous for the wines, but it also has other spiritual attractions. And this is, well, it looks like Mount Athos more than anything else, but we're still in Spain. And it's a very beautiful place and worth visiting. Well, this is a cave where he lived, but then there's also a church built within the mountain, which is still preserved, where he lived with his community. And this is what it looks like. So most of what you see here would also correspond to the 7th, I guess, 8th century, but it was enlarged in the due course. So various parts of the church would correspond to various periods. And this is an ark. Well, this is a, now I'd be forgetting my English. Well, Father Ilya, what would it be where the relics of the saints are being preserved? The
Reliquary.
The relic. Well, it's not really a reliquary, it's something bigger, no? An arch, you'd say? No?
Ark?
Ark, yeah.
Yeah, so, but commonly still will be a reliquary.
Well, the actual ark that you see is contemporary because the original was destroyed by the Napoleonic troops, but the ivory fragments are original. And they date with sort of 11th century, and some of them are missing. 2 of them you can find in the Museum of Hermitage in St. Petersburg, and a couple of them are in the United States. But I have to double check which museums exactly. I should have done it before the talk, but I think maybe in Boston. But I'd have to double check. But it's a beautiful piece of work, 11th century. Well, there's also another icon of the Spanish saints, which was painted by a friend in Russia. In the first row, you have the 2 martyrs, sisters in Sevilla, Justa and Rufina, Saint Eulalia of Barcelona, and in the back, on the left and on the right, are the bishops, Saint Isidore and Saint Leander of Sevilla, Osius of Cordoba, and Apostle Santiago. Now, these are the relics of Saint Leander in Sevilla, and the relics of his brother, Saint Isidore, in the cathedral, well, in a basilica in the city of Leon, also in the north of Spain. Now, when we spoke about the monastic tradition in the Visigothic Spain, and we said that some of the monks would live in the cities where the relics of the important saints were preserved, but some of them lived in the mountains, in the desert. And there's this part of Spain which some people would describe as Spanish Cappadocia, which would of course be an exaggeration, because in this monastic settlements you wouldn't find or hardly find any art to observe. But there's a certain parallel with the Byzantine cave churches. Well, dating them is difficult. So there'd be all kinds of theories up to, some people would say that people were escaping from iconoclasm in the Byzantine Empire and they would find refuge here. But on the whole, which would hardly be credible. But on the whole, these churches that we're going to see now would be, we'd say between sort of 5th and the 8th century. And geographically, we're once again in the north of Spain, somewhere between the Castile and Leon and Cantabria and the Basque country. So this is what they look like. So maybe this is not the idea of Spain that you had before the talk, but then if it changes, you can see these graves where the monks would have been buried. This is an altar.
It is very similar not only to Cappadocia, but also to southern Italy. So there
Well,
is,
yes, and even to Crimea.
and
Some similar
France, in France, there are certain regions where you can find troglodyte churches.
But it seems like Georgia.
Yes. And once again, you see this kind of a keyhole form in the entry to the altar. Now, this is, of course, Italy. This is the mausoleum of Galla Placidia. No, this is, I think this is how you would say, which is 5th century. But why do I show this photo? Because if you come to the north of Portugal, to the city of Braga, you will find this church. And of course, the builders obviously knew the mausoleum in Italy. This is 7th century. And this is a church where a saint, whose name was Saint Fructuous, where he was also buried in the 7th century. But although there is no mosaic and no art inside. And this is an ark of relics of Saint Martin, who died in the 6th century. And dating this ark is, well, it's complicated, you know. So some people would give the date of the 6th century, which is end of the 6th century, which is when he died. Some people would suggest later dates, but I would be inclined to think that it's a earlier object. So in the center here, you see what many people would think is the figure of Saint Martin in the center. He was a very important figure in developing the monastic culture in this part of Spain. And there are very few photos which you can find in the internet. So these are the photos that I made when I was there. Well, this is a map of the Visigothic kingdom at its best before the Arab conquest. So you can see that it occupies the whole of what we now call Spain and Portugal, little part of Africa, and also part of what is now France. Covadonga. This is a place of this famous battle in 721, from which the Reconquista has begun. So for any Spanish person, it's a very important place for the identity of this nation and of this country. Now, these are the churches which we normally identify as pre-Romanesque. So this is 9th century. All of them are in Asturias, which, as I said, was the only part of Spain which was not, which remained free from the Arab conquest. And when you look at it, it's really quite amazing to see how the architects used the landscape when they were building the churches. Now inside, this is when we're celebrating the liturgy, but you can also see that, well, you don't see it very well in this photo, but there are certain, in many of these pre-Romanesque churches, there are holes in the floor in the place where we would place iconostasis. So it's quite obvious that there was some kind of a visible division between the sanctuary and the rest of the church, although you'd have to use your imagination to say what it was like, but it was there. 9th century. Also 9th century is the crypt of St. Leocadia in the Cathedral of Oviedo. Well, obviously called the crypt of St. Leocadia because this is where her relics were kept before they were taken to the north of Europe and later on in the later Middle Ages, they were returned to Toledo. So here you can see kind of very minimalist architecture. And of course you can see this line on the floor, which is where we would find our iconostasis. Now, this is one of the great treasures that we have in Spain. This is what we call, well, in Latin it's called sudarium, and equally we call it sudari in Church Slavonic. So the holy cloth, which was on the face, according to the tradition, which was on the face of Jesus Christ after his burial. And this is something that Apostle John describes when Peter comes to the tomb and he finds the shroud and this cloth which was laying apart. And it is interesting that we can trace the history of this relic up to at least to the 7th century. And basically we consider that it was rescued from Jerusalem in the year 614 with the Persian invasion. Then it ended up in Alexandria, then in the city which was called a New Carthage, which we now called Cartagena in Spain, then in Toledo, and then in Oviedo, where it is already in the 9th century. So this is a holy object which has been there for the last 1,000 years. And of course, it dates to the time which was long before this massive falsification of relics in the Western Europe. So everything basically points to this. Also, some scientific investigation of the Sudarium and of the Shroud of Turin show that they are in the sense identical. So this is a small chapel where it is kept together with other important relics of the saints, which were gathered here from the whole Iberian Peninsula to save them from the conquest. A church of St. Peter in Cordoba, which has relics of the martyrs, sort of mixed. Some of them would be the Roman martyrs, but many of them would be those who suffered in Cordoba in the 9th century. Well, this is interesting. This is Rioja. We're not in Syria. We're not in Egypt. We're in Spain. This church would be, well, most people would date it with 10th century. And if you look inside, then it looks as Eastern Orthodox as it can be. So you can see very well the sort of separation between the sanctuary and the body of the church. Tenth century, this is what kind of architecture which is usually described as Mozarabic. So we find it in the north of Spain, in the parts of it which were reconquered by the Christians, and where many people from the south, from the Muslim south, would move to live. So, of course, well, the part that you see on the right is Romanesque and it's later, but the part you see on the left is quite authentic church dedicated to St. Michael. And the columns that you see here would, of course, be recycled columns from all kinds of Roman structures before that. This is another Mozarabic church in the north of Spain, in Cantabria, called Santa Maria de Lebenya in the mountains. And this is a very interesting stone, which is most likely pre-Christian, but it was used as a part of the decoration of the church, which was found itself on the floor, lying with the symbols down to earth, but it was then lifted, and we can see it now. And actually, when we did the altar table in the cathedral, some of these symbols we used. And this is when we celebrate the liturgy. And again, once again, you can see this very typical Spanish keyhole composition. Well, it's a monastery in Cantabria, in the mountains, which has the biggest part of the Holy Cross in Spain, and also, well, there's a you can trace its origins once again to Jerusalem and to the conquest of Jerusalem by the Persians in the year 614. Another 10th century church in the mountains in the northern part of Spain called Santiago de Peñalba. Also, we celebrate the liturgy here. This is what we may want to call the Spanish desert. It's an interesting church here, which also has some pieces of art and frescoes, some of which you can find in the Museum of Prado because they were taken off the walls, but some of them are also in the United States, for example, in the Boston National Gallery. So it's kind of very early Romanesque. There is a pillar, like a tree of life, but the church is built upon the Visigothic caves. Now, we are almost finished. It's an interesting saint whose name in Spanish would be Saint Orosia or Saint Eurosia. There is very little that we know about her, but there is a tradition that she was traveling, crossing the mountains, the Pyrenees, and she was Christian. She was supposed to get married to a Christian here. And her group was stopped by the Arabs who demanded that she convert into Islam, and she is married to to an Arab military official in Cordoba, and she said no, and she died as a martyr. But why is she interesting? Because there is a tradition that her origins are from Moravia, which is the land of St. Cyril and St. Methodius. So if this tradition is authentic, we can say that she was one of the, she's the only early Spanish saint with who has a Slavic blood. Now, this is a reliquary with her skull in a small village in Aragon, in the very mountainous region, and the rest of her relics are in the city of Jaca. But from this little village where we can find this reliquary, there is a trail that goes up to the mountains to the place where she suffered martyrdom. So once we took our parishioners and we decided to go up the trail, which is very beautiful. And this is really quite unlike Spain, but this is maybe as you imagine it, but this is what it looks like. And when we were going up, the weather was fine, and you can see these little chapels, and we're going up and up into the mountains, and it is beautiful. But when we're there, you can see the Pyrenees with the snow on the peaks. This is a church that you see in the middle, which is built on the place of her martyrdom. There is also a font of water. But then this terrible rain began, which we were not really prepared to face. And there was only one man that we found around, and I realized that he speaks Spanish with a very strong accent, which I thought that he was local, but he ended up being Ukrainian, and he was looking after the sheep. So he was very happy to see a group because at least an important number of them are from the same part of Ukraine where he was. So he spent some time with us while we were hiding from the rain, and he had this little dog which was called Trotsky. So this is one of the memories of our pilgrimage that we did in this country, which you would all be welcome to join once the COVID time finishes. Now, can you see me?
Yes.
Father Ilya?
Thank you, Father. It's wonderful.
Well, I tried to do it in 1 hour. I think I was quite punctual.
Right. Well, no. Well, we can sit and listen for you forever. Don't get us wrong. That's not the thing. I posted some questions that I had, but maybe our listeners have some questions as well. So please send them via chat, or you are most welcome to turn your microphones on, and then we'll be able to, and Father Andrew would be able to answer them. But maybe you can start with my few questions that I have sent.
Okay.
So can you see them, or shall I read them to you?
I don't see them. I think you're better off reading them.
Okay. So when you mentioned Saint Osius of Cordoba, the question came up, one of the pre-communion prayers attributed to him, is it really possible, or it's a mixture in our tradition of some sort? So,
well, I think we would have to study the manuscript tradition, but is it really by Osios? Are you sure? Pre-communion prayers by Osios?
Of Corduba, yes. You know, an old prayer book for clergy, one of the, and in fact, of course, that may be, sounds completely ridiculous. I don't know Spanish, but in that prayer there is expression is ole, and it's kept like that in Church Slavonic.
Well, if you send me the text, I don't really remember it now by heart, but if you send me the text, I think I would need to double check it.
Okay,
but
absolutely.
Authorship is tricky.
Right, but why him? All of a sudden, I'm not defending the ascription of prayer to him. I found it rather strange, but nevertheless, it's very interesting.
Let's do some work on that.
Okay, all right. Okay, Oviedo and Sudarium there.
Yes.
Why it did not get the major provenance as far as a pilgrim destination in comparison, say, to Santiago? You know, it's such a major relic and it's there forever, and many people are taken by surprise when you mention something about the Sudarium.
Well, sometimes it's hard to say. I mean, even if you ask, you know, why does Santiago de Compostela become so important in the medieval world? Because there are many shrines with the relics of the apostles. You know, the relics of St. Mark in Venice, the relics of many apostles in Italy. So, you know, when I asked people, why does Santiago de Compostela become so important? No one could really provide me a decent answer. But of course, in Oviedo, they're trying very hard to be the center of the pilgrimage. And they say that there's someone who comes to the Santiago and does not come to Oviedo, are worshiping the creature and not worshiping the creator. And one of the routes that take you from to Santiago, which is called, it's called the primitive route, which takes you from Oviedo to Santiago. Now, it's not called primitive because it's simple. It's actually the most difficult because it takes you through the mountains, but it's called primitive because it was the Spanish king Alfonso who did his first ever pilgrimage to Santiago from the capital in Oviedo. It's hard to say why it hasn't become central. I think it's sort of becoming more central. So I think, of course, any Orthodox pilgrim who would come to Spain, he would find it difficult to avoid Oviedo. But was it, for example, the shroud in Turin, has it really been center of medieval pilgrimage? I don't know. I'm not.
Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that because Shroud of Turin, of what we now call Shroud of Turin, ever since the sack of Constantinople was in private possession, was not widely known.
Well, that's true.
And it was not known in the West so widely prior to 13th century anyway. Mm-hmm. So it was brought by the Crusaders. It is attributed, to burial cloth of Christ, whether it was Shroud of Turin or something else. Church of Blackerne was the place where it was held. At some point, it says it was brought to Hagia Sophia, like on Holy Friday, perhaps, and then Crusaders taken up to the west, and then it reemerges in 1347. That's why it says that.
Well, the Sudarium of Oviedo has been accessible, and it has been in this chapel for the last 1,000 years.
Right.
But the thing is that maybe also, I think that the actual tradition of pilgrimage has somewhat burnt out by the late medieval period. So, there would be much less people coming to Santiago as pilgrims in this, for example, 17th century than in the 12th. So mm-hmm. There has been a certain decline of the pilgrimage tradition. And of course, this huge amount of pilgrims who are coming to Santiago now, it's really something that has been revived in the last few decades, because pilgrimage also needs infrastructure. So, there was this trails and some places where pilgrims can sleep, where they can eat. Somehow Santiago has not been on this Oviedo hasn't been so much present on the pilgrim's map. But I think it's the interest is revived.
I personally find it perhaps the most fascinating pilgrim destination in Spain, but I may be mistaken.
And you can see it three times during the year. So what you see when you come to the chapel is a copy. The original is there, but it's protected against the light. But they take it out on Holy Friday. They take it out on the feast of St. Matthew and on the feast of the Exaltation of the Cross. So 3 times a year you can actually see it physically, and you can come to see it quite closely, much better than you can see it at the shroud in Turin.
Okay. Now, suggestion that the relics in Cathedral of Santiago did not belong to St. Jacob, but to somebody else, to some other early saint or church dignitary. Was there any formal research done to that, or where that suggestion comes from?
Well, there has been no research, but for example, if you open the monograph of the great Oxford professor Henry Chadwick, that I have the honor to have heard, he has, well, I think it's the only monograph dedicated to an important personality in the history of the early church in Spain, whose name was Priscillian, who was a bishop in the 4th century, and he was condemned as a heretic. And it's a very interesting case, because basically he's considered to be the first person in the history of the Christian church who was condemned to death by Christian community for holding wrong beliefs. Now, whether he was really a heretic or whether he really believed in the things that were ascribed to him is a big question. We can really describe Priscillian as an ascetic, and many people would describe his asceticism as somewhat extreme. But what we know is that until at least the 6th century, there has been a certain veneration of Priscillian in the Iberian Peninsula. And in dedicating his monograph to Priscillian, Henry Chadwick, on the last page on his monograph, he suggests that the grave in Santiago is a grave of Priscillian. And he says that it's not unknown to the early church that a place which would be associated with a cult, which would be in a way unorthodox, would be in a sense integrated into the ecclesiastical usage. Well, of course, it's a hypothesis. I would not want to affirm it, and I would not want to argue against it. But from what I know, there has been no scientific research of the relics in Santiago. If the Sudarium in Oviedo, it has been widely researched by the physicist, but I'm not sure that the grave of Santiago has been opened recently for research in the same way as, for example, the relics of St. Nicholas in Baria. So it really remains a matter of belief. But what I know is that Apostle Santiago, from what I know from experience, is very present there, through the prayers of the people who come. But of course, I also understand that there are some historical critical difficulties with identifying his grave in the northwest of Spain, because the tradition says that his relics came miraculously by sea from the Holy Land. Now, well, you may want to accept this, or maybe you want to look for some other explanation.
Is there any archaeological evidence or suggestions to how Christianity spread throughout the peninsula? It is understandable that Arabs described everything, but is there any suggestions whether missionaries came from the continental Europe, from France, from Italy, or it came from North Africa? Because North Africa was very active, it's hotbed of Christianity.
Well, from what I know, most of the archaeological evidence would point, as I said in the beginning, to the southern part of Spain, to what we now call sort of Andalusia. And I think many historians would think that that in a very special sense, the Christians in Spain at the time were linked to the north of Africa. So up to thinking that the Christianity was actually brought to the Iberian Peninsula from the north of Africa. So I think that, of course, the most archaeological evidence in this sense you'd find, well, if you're speaking about this earliest period of time, would relate to the south of Spain. But of course, if you're speaking about the Visigothic Spain, then you can find it as pretty much in the center and also in the more northern parts.
But so there is some,
for example, church not far from Toledo, which is almost Madrid, is partly reconstructed. It's not in such a perfect state as the ones that I showed you, but there is some evidence of Visigothic church architecture not far from here.
Right. I meant more the earliest Christian presence, you know, like at the dawn of Christian era, even before the Goths and such.
Well, before the Goths,
like who's responsible for conversion of Iberian Peninsula?
Well, you know, if you are, you know, the tradition is that there were this, what they call in Spain, the Barones Apostolicos, who were the disciples of the apostles, who were converting and preaching in the south of Spain. The tradition of Barones Apostolicos is quite doubtful, but it also has some historical foundation. So, for example, it seems that the names of these people would be the names of the first known bishops of the sees in the south of Spain for example, in the 3rd century or slightly earlier.
Okay.
So, but most of the archaeological evidence dating to this period you'd find in the south.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you, Father. Well, dear guests, if you have any questions for Father Andrey, please use this opportunity to ask any questions you'd like.
Yes, I have a question. This is Michael.
Yes, Michael.
Is the lack of frescoes in any of the churches that we saw in the pictures, is that attributed to the iconoclast influence at that time?
Well, there is no evidence of what we identify as iconoclasm in Spain, apart from this one of these acts of the Elvira Council. I think it's really the other way around. We saw the Visigothic church with figurative carvings. Then if we look towards the later tradition and this church architecture, which we identify as pro-Romanesque, 9th century, one of them has parts, some parts of the frescoes conserved, but they're not figurative. So you'd find sort of crosses and floral motifs, but also in some of them you would find some stone carvings which would be figurative. So on the whole, I think that there is no ground to describe the church art in the first millennium as iconoclast, apart from this sort of small evidence from the Elvira Council. So when things when they don't reach the present, it doesn't really mean that they were non-existent. But I think that the evidence, artistic evidence, which is there and which I try to show, I think it makes a theory that the art in Spain in the first millennium was iconoclast. I think it makes it very doubtful. I think that there is an important tradition.
No frescoes that, or very few frescoes that exist from that far back, right?
If I may add something, Father Andrey, it is indeed so for very practical reasons that frescoes did not survive. Even from much later period, only frescoes that were done with an incredible quality of masonry, so meaning preventing the leaks and right mixture of the plaster that was put on the wall in those areas that survive. But there, where they are surviving, it's pretty much universal evidence that churches were decorated everywhere. We have evidence from early, perhaps 7th or 8th century in France in several places. We have evidence to that in northern Italy, to less degree in Spain, but in the Holy Land and Palestine. So pretty much everywhere within the Christian realm, we see part of the figurative art, either painted or carved. And if it was carved, you didn't have to guess. There were mosaics as well, and there were frescoes, and there were, of course, panels as well, by far lesser degree than we have it in the East, but in the early church, there were not too many panel icons to begin with. It's as a result of iconoclasm, but figurative art was pretty much universal to whatever degree in particular locality, but it was definitely present. Scarcity of early Christian art in the West could be attributed also to the fact that during the Renaissance and more so during the Baroque period, many of the churches were redone in the style of the era, and all of the early Christian frescoes, they were covered under the decor of the Slavish Baroque cathedrals, where various carving and gilding took place over the pictorial images. And there are a number of churches in France, a number of churches in Italy, where some restorations have been done, say after the earthquakes, and where beautiful Romanesque frescoes, very similar in style and in the layout to the Byzantine frescoes, come to light, even within the 20th century. And there are literally dozens upon of dozens, and I wouldn't say without exaggeration, perhaps several hundred, if not few hundred, of churches throughout northern, central, and southern Europe in particular. No wonder in the south is better climate, that point out that frescoes are surviving. Well, early 7th century, talk about Switzerland as well, Austria, where we're talking about second part of the first millennia. In Spain, most of the Christian art is a little bit later, but we're talking 11th, 12th century, was surviving in huge quantity and an excellent state of
quality.
It was not new, because churches that were surviving in the countryside. And again, there were dozens upon dozens of them, and many were in very poor localities. And what happened that by accident, on several instances, thieves were caught that were chiseling off frescoes in order to sell them. That's how you see part of the Cloisters Museum in the Metropolitan is cathedral from Spain, is part of the monastery from Spain. Altar apses in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Boston, where it is Philadelphia or somewhere else, there are at least 3 apses. Those are illegally taken, stolen basically, and sold frescoes from a number of churches in Spain. So Catalonia, what started to happen that Spain had spared the effort of taking off all of the surviving frescoes from the period. And fortunately for frescoes, unfortunately for us, they succeeded of taking numerous masterpieces and put them in various museums. There is a huge museum of Catalan art in Barcelona. There is some in Museum of Prado, but there are some diocesan museums in Vic and in other parts where dozens of those altar apses, frescoes from them surviving, and churches staying stripped of the art. But it was a necessity of the 20th century and thievery. So surprisingly enough, we could say that churches were perhaps decorated not that differently from what we used in the Byzantine. I mean, of course, shape of the frescoes was different, but most of the churches had some form of pictorial art. What we see as bare representation and saying that simplicity is blessed and corresponding more to the early Christian era is simply incorrect. Churches, at least that were in the empire or imperial time, post-persecution, they definitely were decorated. At least the altar apse was definitely decorated with pictorial art and perhaps carvings and statues and mosaics for sure.
Yes, just a few things.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I mean, what you say is quite right, but I think what was asked about, you're speaking about the Romanesque frescoes.
No,
So
but I'm saying that they're continuations. They couldn't have sprang
mainly,
out of
yes,
nowhere.
mainly 11th and 12th century. So in this case, for example, of course, Spain is very important. And if you go to the city of Leon, and the Royal Pantheon is sometimes described as the Sixtine Chapel of the Romanesque art. And it's very well preserved. And of course, this is one of these places where you can see that the Romanesque tradition is very close to the Byzantine tradition. But I think what the question was regarding the frescoes in the of the churches in the first millennium that we're talking about.
Oh,
Well, if I'm not mistaken, the only church belonging to the first millennium where you can find some parts of the frescoes is a church in Asturias, not far from Oviedo, which is called San Salvador de Valdedios. If you want, you can Google it. San Salvador de Valdedios. It has some frescoes, but as I said, they're not figurative, but they're quite well preserved. There are some ornaments and there are some crosses. So to my knowledge, if I'm not mistaken, this is the only church which belongs to the period that we're talking about, which has some parts of the frescoes. But it seems that many others, they could have had them, but they were lost in the course of time.
No, but Father Andrey, I'm not contradicting. I expanded into the Romanesque. I'm just saying that churches in Italy, in Austria, in Switzerland, and in France that belong to the first millennium, second part of the first millennium, they do have frescoes.
Yeah.
But they're very poorly surviving overall.
Yeah.
So there are very, very few examples. So it's the same, more or less the same cultural context. So we may safely assume that there were frescoes in Spain as well. Just examples are so rare and so unique that it's hard to, you know, give a firm presentation on them. It's just they're not surviving.
I have a question.
Yes.
You know the trip that you talked about, the pilgrims going on where they could get a diploma for traveling all the way they went?
Yes.
I was wanting to know, Father Ilya, do you take your pilgrims on that trip?
We haven't been to Spain yet.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. And do you have a lot of people that actually do that?
Yes. Well,
Yes. In France also. It's very popular in France to do this.
Well, because the French way begins on the border with France. So
Yes. Very,
and
very
through France, and through France, you know, there are several passages. There are one passage that passed from Switzerland all the way through.
Yes, exactly. Swiss comes to France and then to Spain. Yes.
And you can begin in Paris with the Tower of Saint Jacques. Saint Jacques is where it was meant to begin in Paris. The way.
I know that you have a lot of places by the region where I'm living. It's near the Alps, Grenoble, Lyon. Then on the churches for these pilgrims, there's always rakovina. I don't know how do you say it.
Like the scallop shell, no? The scallop shell. It's the symbol of the pilgrimage.
Yes, pilgrims in the past
because,
times.
What in English you call the scallop, in French you call Saint Jacques.
Yes, exactly, Saint Jacques, la coquille Saint Jacques.
Oui.
Yes. So they knew that they could be accueillis, that they are welcome in these churches where they saw this. It was a sign for French people to go to Saint-Jacques-de-Compostelle. Sorry.
Yes,
my English is not so good as my French is.
So any more questions, Franz?
Father, could I ask?
Oh, absolutely.
Thank you.
In whatever language.
I'll try in English.
I know that you do beautiful work on cloth, which is very impressive.
Thank
and
you,
I've been
Father.
following you on Facebook for some time.
I'm glad to see you after so long time. Father, you said about architecture that maybe Muslims' architecture comes from First Cortex, is it your own thought, or you can say that there are some literature about this question?
Well, it's not just my theory. There are many people who would think in this way, but I would not be able to provide biography right now. But if you want, I can.
No, of course, of course. I will write.
Look it up, and I can share it with you.
Because
but on the whole, you know, if you accept, well, I mean, if you look at the churches that we've seen,
yes, it's so interesting.
And the Visigothic churches, you know, most people would date them prior to the Arab invasion. So you cannot say that these forms are Arab influence, because they're just early, they're earlier than the Arabs came.
Because I have thought maybe they took it from one place, but different ways.
Well, you know, when the Arabs came to Spain, Islam is still very young.
Yes,
and it doesn't have its own artistic tradition. You know, they have a lot of force, they have a lot of energy, but they have very little art. So they have to get inspiration somewhere. And, you know, we'd need to consult a historian of art, but I think that it is really quite more than likely that these churches are older than the than 711. So.
Thank you. Well, I'll write in Facebook about it because
make an investigation. Well, I mean, there is a certain skepticism. I mean, some people would say that, for example, San Pedro de la Nave is not 7th century, that is 12th. But I think it's quite ridiculous because, you know, in 12th century Spain, you have proper Romanesque art as everywhere. And there would be no meaning to say that suddenly among this Romanesque tradition appears something so archaic. It just makes that doesn't work to me. Yes,
but it's interesting. You showed 6th century or 7th century.
Well, San Pedro and San Juan de los Baños, like the two proper churches, are 7th century.
And they have special art.
Yes, they're 7th century, and the cave churches that we've seen are, well, most likely the same period. Although some people would suggest later dates, but for example, San Juan de los Baños, there is a document of dedicating the church in 661. So, and the Arabs come some 50 years after.
Thank you.
There is a field for investigation. So when are we to accept pilgrims from the States? Hopefully soon.
Well, as soon as possible. But Spain is so huge. I mean, just in order to see what you showed us, we need a month there.
Well, we kind of have a pilgrimage route which lasts for about a week or 8 days, but it doesn't include Barcelona, and it doesn't include the south of Spain. So it just goes along the north and all this sort of most Arabic and Visigothic stuff. So.
But you're there, you want to see it all, huh?
Between going to the south and seeing Granada and Sevilla and Cordoba, or going to the north, or following some kind of alternative route. But Madrid is in the center, so it's kind of a base camp.
Mm-hmm. But we'll come one day, and hopefully sooner than later. We're just praying for this menace to pass us by, and then we'll be ready to depart.
The United States is also close to us these days. We cannot go freely to America from Europe. We're contagious.
Mm. So are we, says Matushka.
So.
Well, dear friends, any more questions? If not, Yes, Claire, please.
Anything else, I'm
yes.
available on Facebook, and also Father Ilya has all my contacts. So if there is anything that I can help you.
Claire here has a question.
Yeah, I'm curious, and you may have covered this. I was late seeing your post, Father Ilya. The Camino de Santiago, is that, are there any Byzantine sites along that road?
Well, if you follow the main route, which we call the French route, there is a considerable amount of Romanesque architecture, which was really the sort of the peak of this pilgrimage route, 11th, 12th century. So that's quite an important number of the Romanesque stuff. But because the relics apparently were discovered only in the 812, there's nothing prior to the period. And of course, the pilgrimage in important numbers began at approximately 11th and 12th centuries, not just to Santiago, but this is when the theme of pilgrimage became important for Europe, when people began traveling and were not afraid of covering huge distances, you know, from Paris to Rome or Santiago or some other place.
Thank you.
So the late night show comes to the end, no?
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Father Andrey.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. For those of you who are English speakers, once again, I want to repeat my invitation next Sunday at 3 p.m.
It's better.
3 p.m. But New York time, 3 p.m. We're going to have Father Peter Farrington. He's a convert priest. He's with the Coptic Church. But he's an Englishman and he researches early English saints. So he'll be talking about coming of Christianity to England, to Roman Britain, better say, not to England, to Roman Britain. A very interesting presentation. Those of you who are Russian speakers, we're going to have two presentations, Moscow at 8 p.m. on Monday by Professor Armen Kazaryan about the monuments of Karabakh, and by Manana Harugashvili on Thursday about coming of Christianity to what's today Georgia. So I hope to see you all. Please come and join us. We'll continue with our lectures. All the lectures are posted on my YouTube, invitation posted on Facebook. So Father Andrey, thank you very much. Welcome new friends. Good to see old friends that never grew old. And I hope to see you again soon. Please stay healthy. God bless. And thank you, Father. Please pray for us all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.